The Resident Evil 3 remake is considered by many fans to be the black sheep of the remakes. Some even believe that it lacks depth due to so much content that appeared in the original being cut away, leaving a much more shorter experience. However, even with its flaws, I believe RE3 is still a fantastic game that needs to be looked at in a different lens. Its shorter runtime and underwhelming puzzles may actually be its strengths when it comes to bringing newcomers into the franchise. So, we're going to take a delve into why Resident Evil 3 is the perfect starting point for anyone looking to get into the Resident Evil franchise. Resident Evil is well known for its complicated puzzles, especially the older games. However, the RE3 remake kinda turned the difficulty of these puzzles down considerably. To hardcore fans, this can feel very underwhelming compared to the more complex puzzles seen in both the RE2 remake and the RE1 remake. But for newcomers, this is the best place to start. Take the substation or the train route puzzle for example. They're pretty straightforward and don't really need a page full of notes, drawings and codes to get you through. For people wanting to get into the franchise, it's quite an easy place to start with compared to starting on Resident Evil 2, which can feel quite daunting in the RPD. Having these puzzles in RE3 doesn't just help newcomers ease in, it also preserves a faster pacing, helping players stay engaged rather than getting frustrated and quitting. Though I do understand hardcore fans being disappointed with this, it's obvious developers are aiming towards a faster pace, which means going off track could have hurt the vision they had during development. One of the major criticisms of the RE3 remake was its shorter runtime compared to the other titles. It's way shorter than the original RE3 and many areas were either cut entirely or shrunk down into smaller sections. For hardcore fans, this was a huge disappointment and left a sense that the remake was unfinished or downgraded. But for newcomers, this shorter length might actually be a major strength for this game. If we want stats of how long it can take to finish RE3, me personally, on my first ever playthrough back in 2021, it took around 6.5 hours to complete, and this was also my first ever Resident Evil game. Compared to the RE2 remake, that game can take up to around 8 to 10 hours just to complete either Leon or Claire's scenarios alone. Again, more content is always better, but with how RE3 manages its pacing, like I said earlier on, it never feels like it's missing anything during a playthrough. Adding in some of the areas cut from the original may have took away from the high stakes escape story the developers were going for. Even though it's always irritating to lose out on content, the remake does a way better job of telling the story, re-establishing characters like Jill and making her a much more in-depth character, and keeping up a pace that keeps players engaged. It's also the perfect place to learn some of the franchise's basic lore, like who Umbrella is and the T-Virus, giving new players just enough knowledge to understand the other games in the franchise, without giving too much information away. Leaning towards more action elements compared to the RE2 remake, RE3 doesn't heavily rely on the player conserving ammo like other titles. However, that doesn't mean that it neglects its survival horror aspects of its DNA neither. Ammo can be found in abundance, as well as crafting materials like gunpowder. Unless you're shooting at everything you see, you'll probably never run out of ammo during your playthrough. Even though this gives the player a layer of protection, it doesn't mean the remake is easy. The enemies in this game are no more or less deadly than the RE2 remake enemies. You can only take a few bites from a zombie to kill the player from full health, meaning careful consideration of the enemy placement is still needed to avoid this. To counteract receiving damage, the RE3 remake introduced a unique dodge mechanic. When a zombie lunges out at the player, they can perform a dodge, but the window for this to work can be truly punishing. A lot of the time it's trial and error to find the perfect time to master the perfect dodge, but when it's done correctly, Jill will enter a slow motion state and the crosshairs will lock onto an enemy if the player decides to aim the gun straight after performing the dodge. This move also ups the chances of a critical hit, which can instant kill some enemies. RE3 truly gets its horror vibes when the stalker enemy, and if not the most famous monster in Resident Evil, makes his appearance. Nemesis has got to be one of the most relentless stalkers in the franchise, and even though his segment when he does arrive is quite short, his unforgiving nature well makes up for it. While fans have been vocal about the Nemesis encounters being highly scripted after this point, this part of the game has got to be one of the best examples and showcases of what Capcom can pull off, and what to expect from other stalkers like Mr. X or Jack Baker in RE7. It is a shame that these moments never happen again later in the game, but compared to Mr. X, who's my favourite stalker enemy in the Resident Evil franchise, he himself becomes less prominent after his entrance in the latter half of the RPD. Back to Nemesis, even with 72 hours of playtime on RE3, he still manages to jump me when I least expect it on every new playthrough. Like I said before, he's the greatest example of a heart in your throat experience in Resident Evil, and honestly, I'm quite sad we didn't get more of it. Overall, the Resident Evil 3 remake has its flaws, and it could have been way better, but it also does a lot of things correctly. The story is tighter and more well presented than the original. It keeps an engaged, fast-paced narrative and gives new players a taste of what to expect moving on to other Resident Evil games. Would I personally rank Resident Evil 3 in a high spot? Probably not, but it got me invested in Resident Evil back when I bought it in 2021, and I've been a big fan ever since. If there is one genuine criticism I have for Capcom about this game, it has to do with the online game that was sold alongside RE3. It was a mode nobody really asked for, and probably is the reason behind why the RE3 remake didn't quite live up to the expectations among fans. However, even if RE3 isn't the best remake out there, it's still a solid game nonetheless and well worth your time playing. If you ever see it on sale at any point, I highly recommend buying it if you really want to get into the Resident Evil franchise.